Good evening. Welcome from a finally bright Brooklyn, New York, which means we are approaching spring. Some of those dark days when the stream would come on and it's dark are leaving us, which is great. Anyway, I'm really excited for tonight's chat. My name is Chris Bear. I am a parent of a child with OCD, a parent, I should say, of a teenager with OCD, and also happy to have two awesome guests tonight as we talk about autism and OCD. But very quickly, before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that this live stream is educational and not intended to replace therapy. For the treatment-related questions, please work with your provider or contact a local clinician. And luckily, the IOCDS website has a great resource directory, and you can find it right there on your screen, iocdf.org/find-help. And you can use that to find a trained clinician near you or one that might be practicing virtually. The IOCDF also is not a crisis hotline. So if you are in crisis or you're ever feeling suicidal or unsafe, please call the 9888 Suicide Crisis Hotline. Here in the US, you can dial 888 from any phone, or you can go to 988lifeline.org. Or if you can do it more immediately, you can go to your local emergency room or call 911. That's here in the US. We want to make sure that this is a safe space, so please be kind and respectful for everybody in the comments. If you're joining us now, please, use the comments. Let us know where you're watching us from, and how things are doing with you. And just to note that this thing is being recorded, so this broadcast supporting families is on several social media platforms, including Facebook and YouTube. And so you can always check in for check a replay, and looking forward to tonight's conversation. Welcome, Jan. Welcome, Josh. Very quickly, everyone. Jan Stewart chairs the board of Kerry's Place Autism Services, which is Canada's largest autism service provider, and you were briefly vice chair of the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. She's part of the IOCDF Canada Task Force that is working to enhance resources and collaboration across Canada, has a long history with the OCD, mental health, autism communities, and most recently, published in a fantastic award-winning book called Hold On Tight, A Parent's Journey, Raising Children with Mental Illness. Welcome, Jan. So excited to have you tonight.
And I feel the same way. Hi, Chris. Hi, Josh.
Cool. And Josh is a licensed psychologist who completed his doctoral education and postdoc training at the University of South Florida. Hope and prayers and thoughts to everybody at FSU right now. And he is an active member of the American Psychological Association, the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, and also the IOCDF. And prior to joining a career in healthcare and I guess becoming a clinician, you served for more than a decade as a submariner in the U.S. Navy. So not only lots of experience on land, but also underwater. This is a great topic. It's Autism Acceptance Month here in the U.S., so prime topic for tonight. Let's start it off. Jan, can you share a little bit about your story? How did OCD, autism, and neurodiversity kind of impact your family? Maybe some of what were some of those early days like as a parent?
Yes, and I'm sure this will resonate with many of you because it's an endless roller coaster. But I would assume, like many of you, my husband and I grew up in warm, loving families, very focused on achievement and success. Neither of us had known true adversity in our lives before. And we both have our MBAs, had great careers, and we had rose-colored glasses on. We naively assumed that our kids would follow in the same successful path when we had them as we. And then we had kids, and reality hit, and our lives were turned absolutely upside down. Now, while both my kids are autistic and have multiple co-occurring conditions, it's only my older child, Andrew, my son, who also has OCD on top of a number of others. And from almost the time he was born, Chris, my husband and I felt something wasn't right. His hands and feet moved in constant circular motion. He never talked to himself or gurgled in his crib by himself, and he had no self-control when it came to feeding. You know how doctors always tell new parents, just feed the baby till they're full. Well, that didn't work with us. We actually did an experiment when he was about 6 months old, gave him as many bottles as he wanted. And to our shock, he downed 5 straight bottles, I kid you not, without stopping, and would have kept going if we had let him. But we were scared and stopped him. He didn't get sick, by the way. And the next morning, we controlled his intake and gave him just 1 bottle. And I found he was just as happy. So we saw that even then there were problems with self-regulation. Now, in hindsight, we know these are a number of neurodevelopmental markers, but we were first-time parents. And every time I approached our doctor, he said to me, Jan, calm down. Andrew's just fine. You need to stop being an overly vigilant triple type A parent. And this is unfortunately very, very common. Essentially, I was the problem. But I trusted my gut and I refused to settle. Over the next several years, David and I had increasing concerns about Andrew. There was impulsivity, distractibility, vocal and motor tics, high anxiety, and there were regressive behaviors. He couldn't maintain eye contact anymore. He became a restrictive eater. He had terrible difficulty between change and transitions. And it just kept going. But again, the doctor kept discounting everything I brought up, saying, look, he's learned to read and write with his peers. He's cheerful and outgoing. He's just a sensitive child. But then suddenly, and it took all the way to age 9, one day he was happily playing, and then the next, seemingly out of the blue, he burst into a 2-hour violent meltdown, frightening, kicking, screaming, punching holes in walls, swearing. And this continued virtually unabated almost every day for months on end. And within 1 month, there was also sudden onset of nonstop rituals. He would touch walls repeatedly for hours. He couldn't walk through doors or put on his socks 20, 30 minutes. They kept changing and escalating. Outside, he would rub his head against shrubs, car tires, poles, and he even got down on the filthy subway floor and tried to gnaw it repeatedly. This was driven by fears that his sister would be kidnapped. He would go down a drain pipe. He was 9, remember? We would die. And he knew none of this made sense, but his brain overrode reason, of course, as it does with OCD.
Yep.
And he couldn't control it. It consumed every part of his life. He was miserable. I felt like I was in the twilight zone. But the oddly fortunate part of this is that I found a wonderful psychiatrist. It was so clear now, his symptomology and behavior, that he was fully diagnosed, not only with OCD and autism, but with Tourette syndrome, ADHD, anxiety, developmental disabilities, and learning disabilities. And those diagnoses were such a relief to me because I could now start him down the path, getting him the right help. And of course, it continues to be that endless roller coaster, particularly because, as I'm sure Josh and I will talk more about, there are fundamental differences between OCD and autism, but they're on the surface. They can look very similar. It can be confusing for us parents and caregivers. But there is help, and there's lots of hope.
Your story, I think, resonates with a lot of folks out there, and I know that this was now. I think we have many more therapists, many more folks, many more resources, many more ways to get in contact. One of which those great resources is on the call with us. Josh, I'm curious. Parents that are going through something that Jen went through, or wondering right now, like what that if their child or loved one might have autism, might have OCD, what are the things they should look out for, and what questions should they be asking, and to try to understand where they might turn to next.
It's a great question, and so first off, Jan, thank you for sharing that as well. I mean, it's a lot, right? So when we kind of think about things to look for, things to kind of be aware of, where do you get more information? The first is kind of something towards the end of what Jan mentioned, which is that on the surface, kind of OCD and autism can seem quite different. They can also seem quite similar. There's a lot of overlap between those kind of conditions and other conditions as well along that kind of arc we talk about, the neurodevelopmental continuum. where there's a lot of overlap in terms of the reasons behind things. I think something that I spend a great deal of time talking with parents about is kind of trying to kind of validate some of the frustration that comes with you'll read some information or go to that wonderful source WebMD that everyone goes to that gives you horror stories of the things that's there. So I guess shout out to WebMD. When you kind of read through, there's some pretty scary stuff that you'll hear. And there's this interesting thing we call diagnostic overshadowing that happens where, if we learn some things about a given condition or a diagnosis and we learn that our child has that, anything that our child starts to do in our mind, it goes towards, oh, this must be because of autism. This must be because of ADHD. This must be because of Tourette. Sometimes, sometimes not. And so I think it behooves us greatly, as hard as it is to get through wait lists of providers. When you start looking for providers who are going to help you, help your family, help your child, one of the things you really want to look for is a provider who has a lot of experience in dealing not just with the condition that your child has, but also that entire kind of host of conditions that are there. And until very recently, it was pretty rare for providers to have any sort of experience or training in dealing with those conditions. And if there's one nice thing about just how common these conditions are, it's that over time our providers have gotten a lot more experience, and we've started to learn a lot more, not only about the conditions, but about the people and the families who deal with them. So there's a lot of other resources out there as well in terms of support groups. You heard about Jan kind of heading up the Canada's largest organization in terms of kind of education and advocacy. The help is out there. Kind of the journey on my end and on a lot of providers' end is trying to make sure that those resources are being connected to the families who need them the most.
Yeah, and, I think it's so important to highlight that a lot of therapists are now kind of treating co-occurring diagnosis. There's and much more awareness of connecting folks that can treat both, or how do we get not only the person with the that needs the help, but also the family, the siblings, and maybe some cases other loved ones. Just want to shout out folks, if you're watching live and you have a question, please just put it in the chat. We love the questions and we will get to them, and that's kind of why we're here. We love to hear what's going on in your world so that we can try to help point you in the right direction when possible. I'm going to ask a really basic question for you, Josh, but somebody out there wants to know, how do I get my child diagnosed with autism? How do we get that, or an OCD? What are the, is there a test? Is there a form, or a genetic test or something? How do we get started down that road?
Great question. So there are some kind of the gold standard for testing when it comes to diagnosis of ASD. Includes something called the ADOS-2, which is the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, 2nd edition. I didn't know that I would remember what that stood for until you put me on the spot. It's the ADOS-2.
Good memory.
Thank you. There are a number of people who are kind of trained and qualified to give that test. Something that's important to remember is that as hard as it can be to find a provider to do that testing for your child, is that, and there'll also be wait lists for that, is that starting with the school district where you're at is usually a great choice, depending upon what state or to Jan's point, province you may live in. The school personnel that are there are trained to do a little bit of screening first. And so when we think about screeners, there are a number of them out there. I'm blanking at the moment on their names, but there are quite a few that are out there, and kind of different districts, different schools have different tools they will use. The point of a screener is, if there's really any chance whatsoever that you have this condition, the screener should let us know that and should suggest that we do kind of a little bit more follow-up testing. When you're kind of trying to find those providers, it's important to remember that depending upon where you live, there are some mechanisms in place to kind of reduce the financial burden of that testing. Because I'll tell you that if you're paying out of pocket and insurance is not covering it, it can be very expensive to do that testing. But we kind of live in an age now where even when we're looking at things like Medicaid and Medicare, those will cover, for the most part, at least some of the burden of that testing. And in some school districts, we're actually fortunate enough that these school districts themselves will provide that diagnostic testing as well. So it's quite a bit easier to get than it used to be. And that assessment process will include not only the ADOS-2, it'll also include things like a cognitive assessment, just sort of to figure out kind of how well and in what ways you're able to process information. It also gives us an indication of, are there maybe some other problems that we need to take a look at? It sort of gives us an idea of what your profile is like cognitively. Depending upon what else is going on and what else those assessments uncover, there may be other measures that are recommended as well. If we're looking for things like OCD, if we're looking for things that kind of cluster together like ADHD or Tourette, conduct disorder, things like that.
If I can add just two things to that, Josh.
Sure.
You mentioned the school, which is great, but of course, particularly with autism, early intervention has been shown to be so important as early as 2. Now, there are certain online autism tests that are free or very cheap, and they're quick. And a lot of parents and caregivers, because of financial constraints or because of that, are attracted to them. I don't know how you feel about them, Josh. They're okay baselines. I think what they do is confirm if you have a concern, but they're not a diagnostic tool. You must go to a professional. And what Josh said is true. It's a multimodal assessment process. It's not only the tests, whether it's the autism test that Josh talked about, but it's an direct observation. There's the childhood autism rating scale that's controversial. There's developmental history, medical history, family history. All that goes in. And sometimes, ideally, it's before school.
No, great point. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say it's like really good to call it because the connection to the internet and AI makes it easier to kind of get some maybe quick questions answered or maybe basic assessments, but all that is just to say like then you want to lean in more, whether it's like calling the school or getting a provider so you can get the appropriate diagnosis and get you down the road faster. If there's anything I learned from for our family and our journey, it's that the sooner you get in with the right therapist and you get that right diagnosis, the faster you can move towards getting on track to facing what you need to deal with and getting that help. Jen, you mentioned things that happened with your family, with Andrew, and how like it developed. What are some of the unique challenges that you and your husband faced as parents? Kind of going through this.
Well, there are many, but let me talk about one or two of them, okay? Because I think, look, every parent and every family faces unique challenges, whether you have a neurodivergent or a neurotypical child. But I think our challenges are magnified because the strains and stresses can be, frankly, debilitating. So one of the most important mindset changes I had to make was to reset the expectations for our lives. OCD, autism, and associated conditions can cause huge disarray in every family member's life. There's going to be fear, anger, and resentment. I can't tell you how many times I've looked at myself in the mirror and said, why me? Why us? But I learned that the key to being able to move forward is to accept. You don't have to embrace it like social media tells you, but to accept the fact that your life may not be as planned for or hoped for in some ways, but it will be meaningful. David and I started our lives like every other parent and caregiver I know, with dreams and hopes of these wonderful, happy, successful children. Yet I was so terrified and drained. And I had to learn to recalibrate my expectations of support from family members and friends in the face of fear, misunderstandings, and stigma. And we know that comes from a lack of education and a lack of awareness, but it permeates. Both of our families were very well-meaning, but we had a very close relative who sat David and me down one day and said, there's nothing really wrong with Andrew. He's just attention-seeking. And again, we've all heard that. Many parents tell me their families don't want to get involved. They're scared to get involved. There are erroneous impressions. There's that fear of the unknown. So you have to learn to limit your engagement with and navigate around those family members who are critical, judgmental, or worse, who think they have all the answers. And there's certain friends, and it's very, very upsetting, that distance themselves. But you know what? It's okay, because we often need different types of friendships. And I've turned to other parents and caregivers of neurodivergent children who have been such a warm, welcoming community. We can even laugh about situations that other families might not understand. And we go from there. Of course, as part of resetting your expectations, you want to remember, and this is hard, to be kind to your spouse or your partner. True for every marriage, but again, those stresses and strains magnify things. So I do believe that my partner may not do what I wanted him to do, but he's trying his best. And so we support each other and we give each other the benefit of the doubt. So that's one. I think the other major one, Andrew's now grown. And as he became a teenager, we really had to face our fears. Just like Andrew has learned in ERP to face his fears, we had to learn to face those fears about what's going to happen when he's grown up and we're no longer able to take care of him. Is he going to be able to function? And so my strong, strong advice to parents and caregivers is, of course, you're going to worry, but start preparing now, no matter how young your child is. You need to look into all kinds of options, whether it's financial supports, employment supports, housing supports. There are all kinds of things that you can look at and that we have looked at, and I can give you examples. And that prepares you so that when the time comes, you know many of your options and it's less overwhelming. Don't be like so many parents who are afraid to face their fears, close their eyes, and blindly assume that some relative or sibling is going to take care of their child. It may or may not happen.
It's part of like giving them the tools, learning if there's anything we learned about OCD. It's like we can be the cheerleader, we can be the advocate, we can make sure that they're getting the therapy on time, or doing the exposures. But like my daughter had to learn it herself. It wasn't like I could give her an antibiotic and then she would recover the same way she did a cold or a virus. It was like, you got to learn this, and that was something over the years you just have to give them that agency to learn. And everything you said about kind of relearning how to parent and reparenting your expectations, I think is really a really great lesson for a parent, especially starting out, to hear, because some of the concerns that at least I felt about, like, well, what are they going to be able to get married? Are they going to be able to get a job and go to college? Like, it's just not the most important thing at the moment. So I appreciate all that perspective. Josh, I know, similar question to you. Kind of what are the unique challenges you face and your colleagues face treating somebody with like a co-occurring condition, like different than somebody who might just come in for anxiety or OCD? You have a couple different things to kind of manage.
I think something that Jan touched on a little bit earlier were the stigma and the messages that you get. And you will get, when you talk about a spectrum, there's a spectrum of messages and beliefs as well, ranging from, Jan, you talked about a relative sitting you and your partner down and saying, oh, there's nothing wrong. You just need to, kind of tell him to pull himself up by his bootstraps or something. You'll start there, and it will range all the way over to, you might as well just take your child and drop them off at a hospital somewhere, and that's where they will raise your child. And so there's a kind of a whole realm of these existing beliefs. Some of them come from our families, some of them come from media, some of them come from well-meaning friends or strangers, and it's really important to kind of figure out, like, what's the real deal? What's the information? What do we know versus what do we think we know? I think it's also important to remember when we talk about the spectrum of kind of autistic existence, is that it's a very old saying, right? If you meet one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And while the nature of the struggles and the challenges that you face may be similar across the diagnoses, what that looks like, what that means in terms of folks' ceilings, of what their potential is, of what their expectations are, of what their goals are, varies incredibly. So from a provider standpoint, the challenge is in kind of helping parents and families navigate the journey from what their beliefs were when they came in to kind of getting everyone, if not on the same page, at least on the same team. And I think sometimes what we'll run into with providers is that the expectations will either be incredibly low or incredibly high. And I would say that it's not necessarily about where your expectations are, but about why they are what they are. And if those are based upon what we see, if those are based upon kind of what the child or the individual in question is capable of doing, okay, we may need to adjust our expectations. If they're based upon something you read somewhere and having nothing to do with your child, there's a little bit of a challenge there to kind of release those and kind of reorient on what's actually going on. And so if it sounds like I'm saying what Jen said in a different way, it absolutely is. On the provider end of things, there's a dance that we do. And sometimes the most challenging piece is to get parents to kind of focus on the name of the game, which is, the long game. What does the future hold? What are the things that we can do right now in this moment that will start building a bridge from where we are to where we're going to be at the end of this? What skills need to be put in place? What obstacles need to be overcome?
That's exactly right. And I think to reinforce what you said, Josh, all of this is so important, but I got a call last night from a parent in tears. She has a non-speaking autistic child with OCD and other co-occurring conditions, and went to a highly respected psychiatrist, she had been told, who treated the child as if they were stupid. It doesn't have to do with intellectual capability. Now, yes, in Andrew's case, he has developmental intellectual disabilities, but not every autistic person does. And so that assumption, and I'm sure you've heard that, Josh, but that's hard when a provider like Josh, who's very qualified and trained, hears that happen. It's very upsetting.
Absolutely. That's kind of part of what we learn in grad school is the poker face, right? Regardless of what you hear, you kind of keep that. And sometimes it's challenging because my eye will twitch a little bit from some of the things that I hear, and I have to remember where that comes from. Sometimes we will do things that are not at all in our best interest or the best interests of our child with the best of intentions. And sometimes it's really difficult not only to deliver that message in a way that, that provides some grace and some understanding, but I think on the part of families and parents, as a parent of a child who's, in university right now, it's difficult to hear that. And it's difficult to hear someone talk about your child in a way that is other than complimentary, that is, that other than wonderful and respectful and positive, even when things are not positive. It's very difficult to hear that message.
You both have touched on a big topic. We're about supporting families, so let's talk about what roles parents can play in supporting their child's therapy here, both on the autism and OCD sides, and then together. And then, how do you both see family and like a family involvement in treatment, especially as you're dealing with both conditions?
Josh, you want to start?
Sure. Boy, so in terms of the biggest challenge, well, one of the ones that I spend a great deal of time thinking about, how about that, and talking with parents about, is that when you think about raising a child, regardless of whether you're talking about neurotypical, whatever that may mean, or neurodivergent, what's interesting is just the sheer amount of effort, the amount of emotional investment, which is not a complaint, by the way, but just the amount of energy that you put in terms of kind of instilling some of those skills, helping them learn some of those lessons in a supportive but firm manner, in such a way that if they're going to fall down, you want them to do it while you're around to help them, as opposed to, when they're halfway across the world and they trip and fall down and don't know what to do. And one of the things that's interesting to me is, as we start talking about kind of diverging from the norm, is that there's no less amount of investment by far. In fact, there's usually a little bit more investment, and it tends to be longer. In terms of, kind of as we look at whatever independence may look like for a child and its family, the nature of that relationship, I think, is a little bit more cohesive, and there's a little bit more involvement, sometimes a lot more involvement from the parent side of things, from other family members in that. And when we look at kind of planning for the future, that plan goes out a little bit longer. And if I could say this in a way where it seems to be kind of rewarding, having done this for a long time, is to start to see that that's becoming more normalized. I'm looking at things from dentists to pediatricians and even internists, so the adult doctors, adult pediatricians. We don't call them adultatricians. Everything from that to all of these other services, everything from banking to driving instruction. It is now much more normalized and seen as kind of much more the way that we do things, for that to include more involvement from parents and family members as kids are becoming older kids, and in a way that's gratifying to me anyway.
Yeah, and I think at the core, we have to remember that autism and OCD affects the entire family. And in fact, that's who, if we want to use the word patient, is from a doctor patient. The family is the patient, not just the individual. I actually haven't found much of a difference in my involvement in terms of treatment when I'm dealing with Andrew's OCD or with his autism. In OCD, I first had to learn, like we all do, not to accommodate it. Before I knew that, we were late to an appointment, I would shove him through a door, or I'd take an alternate route if I thought it might upset him. But we know that all that does is fuel the OCD. But beyond that, I think the key is I have become his treatment partner. I was his treatment partner as a child, and I'm still his treatment partner today. Now, because he's an adult, he has to give permission for me to talk to his therapist and his psychiatrist, and he is willingly do that. And that allows us, so we both email his therapist and his doctor before each session with our observations and questions. During the session, he starts alone, and then I come in, we talk about everything, get on the same page, we get a plan together, and then he and I can practice strategies at home. And it might be repeating mantras. One of his mantras is, sitting with uncertainty is really hard, but I can do it. Or it might be, now part of Andrew's OCD, it's three-pronged, is he has just right or Tourette OCD. So his TV stand got dented a tiny bit and he got locked on, needing a new TV stand. No obsessive thoughts, but an overpowering feeling of unease. And so we go and stare down at it on purpose, because that will fuel it. So he's currently working with his therapist on that kind of thing. Also, he has body focused repetitive behaviors with lip picking and scap picking, which are by far the hardest nut to crack for him anyway. But also on the autism side, he's working on social boundaries and his tendency to over communicate. And what I really love is there can be humor in it, because sometimes, I don't know, is he doing a ritual OCD? Is he stimming? Is it autism? Or is he ticking? Is it Tourette syndrome? But because we've always been so open and educated him, he's pretty self-aware, and he'll say, no, Mom, that's not my OCD, or thanks for reminding me to do a strategy.
I mean, clearly it comes from a lot of parents needing to be educated both by their therapist, the things you learn from the community, but that is why, the family is so important, to also help in the recovery and help kind of learn what not to do and learn behaviors yourself. I certainly know the uncertainty, just living with uncertainty is something that that is a lesson I've learned, and a good lesson I've learned from just watching those folks who go through OCD and fight their battles, is that it's okay, and that it's a good thing to accept. I just want to do a shout out, Dottie, Wiley, Nathan. Thank you so much for your questions and comments. Really appreciate you joining in. I want to ask a question from the crowd. Kim asks, their adult child refuses all help. Is there anyone who can train her, or how can the parents in this case get some understanding and acceptance? Sounds like the child has ASD and OCD, so ways that when you might have refusal from the child or the adult child, what are some suggestions you would offer a parent to kind of help get involved or get understand and get some education? Either Jen, I'll throw that to you.
Sure. So 2 points. One is, if you haven't read Alec Pollard's book, which came out last year, called When a Loved One Won't Seek Mental Health Treatment, it's a wonderful book for parents of adult kids who won't seek help or say they'll go and don't actively participate. And he has fabulous advice. So that's just on the side, because the key point there is you can learn to control, you can only control your own behavior. You can't control what your child does when they're an adult, unless you're their legal guardian. And by the way, David and I are Andrew's legal guardians. That's a little different. But for many, that doesn't happen. And so you have to start living your own life. And he gives lots and lots of tips. So look, I think it's basic advice for us parents and caregivers. If you need support, reach out for it from any way you can. Find your own therapist as long as they're trained in understanding these co-occurring conditions, because a general psychiatrist really won't. They're well-meaning, as Josh said, but they're not trained and qualified for this. For me, I have found that parent support groups have always been the best. And finding other parents and caregivers of similar kids where we really can help one another, guide one another. We've been through it. We intrinsically know what's going on. And so it's not less training because every situation is different, but it's taking back control of your life in terms of what you can and can't do.
Well said, Jen.
Just very quickly, can you repeat the name of the book? Yeah.
I may have it slightly wrong, but it's Alec Pollard, When a Loved One Won't Seek Mental Health Treatment. So please don't hold me to that, but I think someone can Google it and put in the chat the correct name.
For parents of, at least on the OCD side, parents that are also dealing with similar issues, there's Dr. Ellie Leibovitz came out with a concept around space, the space program, which is there's a book about that as well. Many therapists have learned to follow that model, which also kind of helps parents figure out how to navigate OCD when maybe their loved one or their one with OCD doesn't really want to seek treatment. Josh, would love your answer to this question though about when somebody is not wanting to seek treatment, how can their parents, their loved ones, also find ways to get support and learn?
Yeah, I think so. First, I absolutely adore Jan's answer, and I think that parent support groups fill an enormous void that as practitioners we aren't really able to many times, other than as a parent, and that is that when it seems like you can't go on, I have seen energy, motivation, recovery support from parent support groups that is just absolutely humbling to see from the outside and to be involved in many different ways. I think from a kind of a therapist or a provider standpoint, something else that's important to keep in mind is when we say that someone won't accept help, I don't want to cast aspersions on providers, but I think it's also really important to take a look at exactly what that help looks like, because I think there are folks who are really good at doing ERP and at modifying ERP for individuals who are autistic as well as having OCD. And there are folks who are not very good at doing ERP or at modifying it. And as much as I wish I could give you a list of people who are good and people who are bad, one, that would be completely inappropriate. But two, you can start to kind of get a feel for it. And sometimes people don't want help because it's really, really hard to accept the help. Sometimes people don't want the help that's being offered because they have a legitimate beef or a legitimate complaint or observation or concern about the nature of the help that's being provided. It's something that we don't talk a great deal about. And, again, it's very difficult to kind of shine a light on that sometimes, but kind of being involved and thinking about the nature of what's being asked of your child when they're being provided help is really important. And your provider should really be able to give you a solid answer as to why they are expecting or asking your child to do the things they're doing. And if that doesn't make sense to you, take a step back, get a second opinion, get a third opinion. It's incredibly important.
It also might be, totally fine that you are the one as the parent going to see a therapist. I don't know, Josh, if you ever had a parent come in and say, listen, I want to be able to use this as a therapeutic environment, but also get trained on OCD so I understand what's going on. So, if you're able to do that as a parent, think about maybe it's okay that you're the one getting therapy and that your loved one is not. At least you're kind of doing things for your own self-care and maybe finding nuggets to learn. And especially, I think, treating. What I want to kind of now move into a little bit is just talking about the intricacies of treating OCD with ERP when autism is there, because I know there's And I've heard Jan talk about this before. So let's talk a little bit about treatment and therapy, because we know that exposure and response prevention is kind of a recognized standard treatment for OCD. But how does that approach change or differ when someone also has a co-occurring condition like autism?
Chris, can I interrupt for one moment? And
Yeah.
just on the last question, there's something very important to add. And that is the IOCDF has several special interest groups. And one of them is on co-occurring OCD and autism. Anyone can join. You can go on the website and you can there's a link and you can write and join, and professionals like Josh speak, and then they have people with lived experience speak, and they have parents and caregivers like me speak. And it's a great font of knowledge as well as the community. So sorry, I wanted to mention that.
Yeah, the SIGs are fantastic. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Good call out. Yeah. So you had asked Chris kind of about treatment and what that looks like, and kind of as we start to go down the road of how do you effectively treat OCD with ERP in the presence of autism. And the cheap and easy answer would be that we have a great literature base, and some of that is also on IOCDF's website as well. When you kind of start to look at what evidence-based treatment looks like, the more kind of nuanced answer is it depends. And when we kind of start looking at ERP and how do we proceed, it becomes really important that we start to take a look at what your treatment targets are. Mm-hmm. So specifically, if you're coming in and something is very difficult for your child and you want some support and you want therapy to kind of focus on reducing the difficulty with that or restoring the functioning, it's really important to start asking some questions about, is the nature of what we're seeing due to OCD or is it due to autism? And if we're starting to kind of verge more towards the autism piece of things, it also becomes important to ask some questions like, is this really something that we should be attempting to treat? Should we be treating it as something wrong that needs to be reduced versus is it indicative of maybe a skill that's not quite there, and we want to work on a skill on the other side that would make it easier not to engage in that behavior that we're seeing? I think when you start to hear people who will have concerns or complaints about ERP, many times it's because there was kind of a swing and a miss. If we start to try to treat something as though it were OCD, and actually the thing that you're focused on is more kind of indicative of being autistic, and on having committed the mortal sin of being autistic in a neurotypical space. And so everyone starts to expect you to act in a certain way, and that's just not a skill that's in your wheelhouse. And so we kind of have to change and tweak a little bit the way in which we approach that to be more of a supportive force as opposed to a force for change or kind of reducing a behavior.
And from a parental view, that means asking, because it's confusing. What do you mean? Is the behavior autism or is it OCD? So what I think I usually ask myself, or I suggest to others, is the behavior causing distress? If the child can't put on their socks, is it because of a sensory sensitivity, which is autism? And, you can work with that. Or is it because there's an obsessive thought that someone's going to be killed or something will happen? And that's OCD, and you don't want to accommodate that. But as Josh said, there are many and very individualized, customized modifications for autistic kids with OCD, but there's some very common ones. And I'll tell you what we've done with Andrew. One is clear, concise, concrete explanations. He's totally literal. So explanations have to be black and white. Work has to be chunked, tasks, homework, anything.
You're anticipating my next question. That's why, because I remember hearing you talk about that. Let's talk about chunking and how that worked for you.
Yeah, so it's the key, because otherwise it can become very overwhelming for the autistic child. So you chunk it into smaller pieces, you breathe, and then you take it step by step. I think visual stories, checklists, reminders, depending on the child again, can really help. But what's key here, and I think Josh would reinforce this, is you must include your child's interests. It motivates them. It makes therapy fun for them. And, Andrew hyper-focused on baseball, and specifically the poor Toronto Blue Jays. But, so that's what his therapist would incorporate. And then there are tools like PECS. For those of you who don't know PECS, it's Picture Exchange Communication Systems. These are boards with pictures, photo, words, symbols that help develop functional communication. And it helps autistic kids express their thoughts and feelings and label their emotions, which many autistic children have difficulty doing. And then their role-playing exercises and discussions. For Andrew, who has great difficulty in with flexibility, he's rigid, he needs certainty, he hates that change. It's role-playing how to deal with situations of change. And I think we have to know that there are a number of autistic children who are not motivated more than non-autistic children to challenge their OCD. And there are a number of reasons for this. The idea of confronting change, as I said, can be pretty upsetting, or they may not be able to differentiate their sense of self from their OCD like non-autistic kids can. And I think finally their OCD can actually serve them, may actually work for them to a certain extent. So all that kind of thing. So again, therapy can go at a slower pace. You need more breaks, more frequent sessions. I still today have Andrew repeat back whatever was said to make sure that he really understands it.
To your point, Jan, which is it's absolutely fabulous. What those can also look like is when you think about kind of breaking things into smaller chunks, but also kind of what we would say more iterations. Normally, traditionally, you would see someone for about 45 minutes once a week. For some people, that's too much, and so it's not uncommon at all for me to see someone instead of 45 minutes once a week. I may see them twice a week, but only for 20 to 30 minutes per time, because more than that, and it just becomes overwhelming. It becomes overly burdensome, and so either that's where we stay, or one of the first treatment targets we work on is gradually increasing the amount of time that's there. Increasing the parent involvement is huge and is key. Another point that you brought up, Jan, was kind of learning to leverage those special interests, the little superpowers, if you will, those areas of interest. And I'm thinking of people who have had a great affinity and interest and knowledge of anything from elephants to elevators, and how we've built those into the treatment plans and taken some of the metaphors that we use in treatment to get a lesson across by placing them in the language of the interest that they have. And these are just kind of things that make sense when we say them out loud, but they aren't always things that we think about until we're planning treatment.
And of course, positive reinforcement and rewards, absolutely critical. Even to this day, Andrew's grown. It used to be baseball cards that it would motivate him. Now he's attracted to the most expensive soap on the internet, Dr. Squatch, if you've ever had it, but it works.
Yeah, I mean, and giving them agency and control over things, a decision in the discussion going on certainly, helps you. And your involvement allows you to have more agency and, ways to make it, more engaging for doing those hard things. It's not going to be a surprise to anybody who's tuned into Supporting Families that I ask this question. Siblings has been a big part of our life. My daughter Charlotte. Has been really active as a sibling of somebody with OCD. So, how can parents help their siblings or other family loved ones understand and cope when their brother or sister, their sibling has OCD, autism, and maybe other conditions? But what advice have you found with siblings? And Josh, have you helped siblings? Do you meet with siblings and talk about how they can help, or what they can do and how they can handle situations that might be troubling?
Yeah, great question. I was actually just dealing with this yesterday, so a very timely question, and it is quite common. And I think there's an interesting kind of balance that's struck. And the first is in terms of siblings, of understanding just how much of an impact they have, upon their siblings, in terms of kind of anything from modeling appropriate behavior to being a source of positive reinforcement, like Jan mentioned, to kind of being the person who may be forging ahead in terms of, if they're the older sibling, they may be going through that new grade or seeing that new teacher first and be able to kind of report back and help with a little bit of notes on what to expect from that. To kind of being their companion when out and about. So there's kind of that aspect of it. And something else that kind of creeps in that we talk about is this idea that we talked before about the amount of investment, and in terms of the amount of attention and the amount of energy that sometimes is necessary. And understandably, when we're talking about kids who have autism and kids who are autistic and also have OCD, they require a little bit more time and attention. And while that's understandable to many siblings, it can also be very difficult to grasp in terms of while I understand you need more attention, it can still be very difficult to see you get more attention than I am. And so kind of talking about ways to at least be able to talk about that out loud and be able to express what that feels like, even understanding the necessity for it, it's important to be able to kind of process through that and talk about it. And it's something that I would not have thought about 20 years ago when I got into this. And yet I find myself having this conversation a lot now with siblings. I suspect Jan has a lot more to add on that.
Yes, and that is exactly bang on. Again, intellectually, we know that every one of our children needs us, but it's hard when you're consumed with a child in crisis or who's very needy to give sufficient attention. One afternoon, I came home from work, and Andrew was in the middle of one of those frightening, violent meltdowns, and I found Ainsley hiding in her closet, shaking in fear. And that was such a wake-up call for David and me. And we started spending whatever time we had, which was very little, doing a couple of things. One-on-one time with her in activities that she enjoyed, must be activities that the child enjoys. She was a real tomboy, so it was playing hockey and playing soccer. It was also baking and some board games. Toronto had an urban farm program for siblings in trauma that was wonderful at the time and started her on a lifelong love of animals. We sent her to sibling support groups. And perhaps most importantly, I shout out about this and hold on tight. I say, talk openly with your children. So in age-appropriate language, we went into a lot more detail about what was going on with Andrew so that it became demystified and less frightening for her.
Sometimes the role that a sibling can play too is that they're just the sibling, and they are they're the one they watch TV with, or the one they play Legos with, or do the puzzle with, or just take a walk to school with, or go to the store and buy a candy bar. Yeah, like those type of things can also kind of allow it always not to be the therapy focus. But what we've learned and talked to other families about is like, the sibling, I think as Jen said, they need to be aware of it. They need to be, it needs to be educated and explained. And then the sibling can also decide how much they want to be involved. Is it like my daughter Charlotte, who was like, I'm going to see the therapist with her and I want to be involved. And I want my own sessions and I want to figure out what's going on and I want to talk and I want to have a voice. Or you just say, I know what's going on. I really don't want to be involved in that. And that's okay. But, it is a family. It affects the entire family. So the entire family kind of needs to have awareness and agency in what's going on. So some of the stuff we've talked about tonight can be heavy and stressful. And I would love to kind of just talk a little bit about things that you've learned and things that, where things are now, maybe, what's your message of hope, positiveness to families and parents out there, things you've learned?
Oh my gosh, you want to go first, Jen?
Sure. It is an endless roller coaster. There's no question about it. And Andrew's had heartbreaking adversity at times, but I look at him today. He's my hero, and I'm just so proud. He has a wonderful full-time job with a lot of support. He lived for 10 years in a congregate group setting, and now he's able to live semi-independently. I go down in the morning and get him up, and we oversee him getting ready for work, prepare his meals, off he goes, but he's still living by himself. And he has this infectious charm that just everyone adores him. Because he has no filter, he'll chat up anyone and everywhere on the elevator, the subway, wherever. Drives his sister and my husband, his dad. They're not so fond of it, but unfailingly, he makes everyone's day happier. And so what I always say is the epigraph to my book, Hold On Tight, is from Teddy Roosevelt. It says, believe you can, and you're halfway there. I really am an ambassador of hope and perseverance. I've learned to celebrate each success, no matter how small. I've learned to laugh at those situations that other families might not understand. And I've learned, and it took me a while, to realize that David and I can and do have fulfilling lives, even though they're different than the ones I envisioned. In my wallet, I carried the lyrics to the main stanza from Everything's All Right, the song Everything's All Right from the musical Jesus Christ Superstar. And the lyrics go, try not to get worried. Try not to turn on to problems that upset you. Oh, don't you know everything's all right? Yes, everything is fine. And I reread that whenever I become stressed, I think we all have to remember we have a choice. We can choose to embrace life, or we can choose to be defeated by it. So please embrace life. Remember, there's lots of help. There's lots of hope. And there's a whole community of us like-minded parents and caregivers out there waiting to embrace you, guide you, and propel you forward. You are not alone.
Yeah. I have to follow that. I shouldn't have let you go first, Jen.
Right.
You know what I'll say, first off, which is absolutely fantastic, having been on the receiving end of many of those folks who will come up and say hello, the people that were kids when I started seeing them, and now they're adults with kids of their own. And not to call out IOCDF here, but since we're here, it seems appropriate. At their conference every year, whenever I go, it's like old home week. Folks will come up and give me a big hug in the middle of the hallway, or come up and just say, "Hey, here's an update on what's happening," and this has been the most rewarding thing of my professional career, and it is wonderful. It's a wonderful feeling. And when I'm working with some of these folks, sometimes just for a few weeks, sometimes for years, even the things that we are not able to change, the act of kind of forging that relationship together, and kind of showing them what's possible, and looking at the things that they've learned, and looking at the ways that they've been able to affect positive change in their own and in their kids' lives is like, are you kidding? Like, if nothing else, this has made the career kind of more than worthwhile. And it is, if you've never been to the IOCDF conference, I heartily recommend that you do that. And I'm not saying that because they're paying me, because they're not. So.
Yeah, it can be incredibly uplifting, invigorating, and just cathartic to meet others that are going through things. I mean, everybody here tuning in, everybody, with Josh and Jan both can probably identify that, like, the folks who are going through it just have a different understanding. So as Jan was saying earlier, you can laugh and love at some things that, and then also cry about things that are going on in your lives. And then share that common bond. And those folks that you see at the conferences, or you meet online face to face, or you have a FaceTime with, or a Zoom call with, can really help you through some of those tough times. And there is a lot of hope and success, and cheer those wins, not only for your kids when they have those wins, but also those wins are you too. When you're, as a parent, my wife and I, every year our kids have a birthday, we say, "Hey, happy birthday to us too," because Vanessa is 20 years old. That means it's a happy 20th parent birthday for me too. So we got to congratulate ourselves too. Okay, very quickly, thank you. I have one more question that I actually want to ask both of you. Any resources that you suggest? There was that book that Jan mentioned earlier, which was in the chat and was put on screen, which is great. Any other, and we talked about the online SIGs. Any other books, websites, podcasts, or things like that that might focus on OCD and autism, and parents also might find support there?
Let me throw a couple out here, and I know, Jan, you probably have a list of them. I think a couple that come to mind that are relatively new is, and I cannot remember for the life of me the name of it, but I believe he's now kind of affiliated or kind of branching off of IOCDF, is a friend of mine named Max, who is autistic and has I believe a podcast that they do now on kind of being an autism expert. And who better than someone who's dealing with autism and OCD? And they've been at conferences in the past that we've co-presented together, and to hear them talk about their experiences now and throw that out there is fantastic. And they are one of the fiercest advocates I've ever met, and it's a pleasure to meet them. So if you have a chance, I cannot remember for the life of me what the name of the podcast is, so I'll have to.
I'm going to pull out my phone because I saw Max. I saw their one of their posts yesterday, and I will look it up.
That's it. I didn't want to throw out my guesses because that'll just mess people up.
That was an Instagram post. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, sorry, Jan.
No, I was going to say the IOCDF has a list of books. Now, I would say that there aren't that many that deal with co-occurring OCD and autism, but that SIG is very important because, just the other week, we had a panel of 3 autistic adults with OCD who spoke. Andrew was going to join me in October, and we're speaking to the SIG online. And Josh and I are going to be presenting at the Chicago conference together with Dr. Jeremy Schumann about co-occurring OCD and autism. So there are going to be lots and lots of resources that you can find.
Thank you for putting the website up there.
Yeah. Okay. I have it. This is the IOCDF that posted Max's. Okay. So we will follow up with that because I don't have the exact Instagram handle and I don't want to give the wrong one. Very
It's
quickly,
exactly
thank
it.
you
I don't
both.
want to guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Josh and Jen, thank you both for joining us. And I'm really excited that, if you have enjoyed this conversation, you'll see it continued and you can actually meet them both in person at the IOCDF conference in Chicago. That's coming up and registration is open now. It's in July 11th through the 13th in Chicago. And you can learn more at iocdf.org/OCDcon. I will be there too. So looking forward to seeing you both in the hallways. And please register. We'd love to see you in Chicago. It's fantastic. I think there might be like 1,200, 1,500 people there and more than half the families. So if you're able to get there, it's wonderful. I also want to give a shout out to Jack MHA. JackMHA.org is the site. They are our sponsors and we really appreciate their work. Jack MHA helps families navigate challenges of OCD and mental health. So fantastic resource for parents. And also don't forget the IOCDF is donor supported. So if you enjoyed this conversation or you use their resources or you've gone to their website, anything that you can help donate to the IOCDF would be helpful. It helps put on broadcasts like this and conferences, and we really appreciate it. You can learn more or you can give whatever you feel like at iocdf.org/donate. We'll be back next month with another topic, but I wish you all the best evening and happy you have a fantastic Autism Acceptance Month. And thanks for you both joining.
Thank
See you next
you.
month.
Thanks for having us. Take care.